Next up on the podcast, we welcome back former podcast guest and also guest host, and that is with Kerry Kincanon. Kerry, welcome back.
Oh, thanks, Matt. So glad to be here again.
And we're recording this in early December, but this is being posted in January 2023. So I'll also say Happy New Year as well. And so if you want to know more about Kerry, check out episode 55 of the podcast back in March of 2022, titled New Ways of Thinking. And you can also check out episode 68 from October 2022, titled Looking Beyond Your Office, where Kerry guest hosts and interviews Clay Schwinn. So Kerry is back as a guest host. And Kerry, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Matt. And what a privilege to be here again and to be in this space to talk about academic advising and especially to be here as Adventures in Advising kind of winds down. I know we're coming to the end of this amazing experience. So I just want to say up top, thanks so much, Matt, for the work that you've done with this wonderful podcast. I think you've really done a great deal to enhance and advance the work of academic advisors. So appreciate that. It is my honor today to be here to talk with Dr. David Spight a bit. And so let me just start by introducing you to David. Dr. Spight began his career assisting undecided students at Colorado State University. In 2008, he was named the Assistant Dean for Academic Advising and Career Counseling in the School of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and was tasked with developing a new center for a new academic unit aimed at helping students explore majors. David has been highly involved in NACADA, the Global Community for Academic Advising, for nationally and internationally, and he served as chair of the Commission on Undecided Exploratory Students, as a member of the council, as a member of the board, as vice president, and most recently as president in 2015 and 16. Spight has presented and published articles on advising undecided students, first-generation students, assessment of advising, and integrating academic and career advising. David is currently the director of undergraduate undeclared advising at University of California, Irvine, and also serves on the faculty in the College of Education at Cal State Fullerton. David is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of College Student Development. David earned his doctorate of education in higher ed administration from the University of Alabama. So I'm just really privileged to be able to talk with David. I'll set a little context here for our relationship, which goes back a ways in terms of the shared connection around working with undecided exploring students. And so I think we're going to dig deep into that. I guess I'll put this out as a caution to listeners today that this will include a healthy volume of nerding out about advising undecided exploring students. But before we get to that, let me just say welcome, David. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to chat. It's always fun to chat with you, Kerry.
Awesome. Great. So before we get to the undecided exploratory stuff, I wonder if you might talk about your own undergraduate academic journey and the build that you've had towards this career as a practitioner and a leader in academic advising. I know you're a first generation student. I know that's important. And I'm guessing you probably would have done this anyway. But say more about how being first gen has shaped your journey and has played a part in your career as an educator.
Yeah. Wow. I think the biggest irony about the work that we do working with students who are undecided exploratory is that I was never undecided or exploratory as a student, right? I had this intention of going to college to be a high school history teacher. And I think part of that was because I think when you're first gen, you don't know all the different possibilities that are out there for career fields. So there's a certain number of careers you think about. And for me, I wasn't that history major that could tell you all the dates for events and things, but I could tell you the stories, right? It was those stories. And I think, so I wanted to go as far from home as I could get, where I could get it paid for. And I managed to get a scholarship at this place that used to be called Northeast Missouri State University. And by the time I graduated, they changed the name to Truman State University, right? I think our graduating class, we're the only class with both university names on our degrees, right? But I went there because they gave me some money, and that was going to get me far from home to try something different. What I didn't know was there was this thing called a FAFSA, right? That had never really been explained to me. And so I never filled one out as an undergrad. And in hindsight, that was both, I think, a big driver for why I went after some of the experiences I did in college. But it was also probably why I didn't have enough money for college a lot of the time, right? So, I mean, I went there and I was lucky in that I went to such a small school that there were lots of folks there that were there to support you. And so I had a great kind of support network that helped me figure out, oh, there's questions I don't know I should be asking, right? There are things I don't know that I should know. But the fact that I didn't know about a FAFSA and the fact that I had such supportive folks is what got me into being an RA myself. I thought, oh, this will help pay for college, right? I was the second, I'm still the second, I guess, the second of 4 kids, right? And I knew that my older brother was still going to be in college the next year. My sister was coming. The year after that, my younger brother was coming. And there was no way I thought my parents could afford 4 kids in college. So I went after this RA job in part to do that. And that led me to actually getting involved in higher ed. It's what opened these doors to seeing that, oh, there are all these different career possibilities, right? And so it's kind of funny not having filled out a FAFSA in some level because I was first gen is what led to that. But I also think it drives a lot of where I start with the practice of advising, right? It's how do I make sure I understand who the student is? What do they know? What do they not know? What do they need to know? Who are they? Where do they think they want to go and why? Right? So much of that comes from that experience that I had of not having all the answers and not knowing all those things. And so I think that's a big part of how it shaped kind of my journey.
That's so interesting. You know, I talk about my experience often with, and I was pretty high context for understanding school. I mean, both my parents were college educated and siblings all went to college and things like that. And even then, I still managed to screw some things up around the way and, you know, not know things. And I think about that as well. You know, someone who had as much context as I did can miss the mark on things. Imagine, you know, for first gen, you know, students who don't have that prior knowledge. There's so much that I'm with you where you have to work off the assumption that folks need to be informed. And
right.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, as I said up top, you and I have both centered a lot of our professional work on working with undecided exploratory students. And, you know, I definitely consider you to be a leading NACADA voice for this population. So let's get into your early days of working at Colorado State. Tell me about the Spight as champion of undecided students origin story. You know, how did you come by this work? Who were your mentors and how did your passion for working with this group evolve and develop?
Wow. When you describe it that way, origin story, it makes me think of like the MCU. There's the NACADA advising universe, right? And it's got its own heroes and anti-heroes and villains, and folks later can decide which of those I am. But that's what I think of when you say origin story. Like, what was the accident that led me to what actually, that's a good way to put it, right? The accident was I had been working as a dorm director, a residence hall director. That's where I thought my career was going to go. And I've been doing it for like 4 years when I woke up one day and I was like, you know, I really like helping students. I don't like living down the hallway from them. Yeah. And I didn't know what I was going to do for a career. So I took a job as an advisor back home in Colorado at Colorado State. And I thought, oh, this will be a fun job until I figure out what I'm going to do with my life. Right. So it was purely an accident to take the job in advising. And I got there and I got this training session that was, it was basically a half-hour training about how do you work with undecided students. And there was some value to it, but the gist of it was you're going to help students find a major. And so then I found myself saying, well, that doesn't really help me understand what it is I'm supposed to do, right? Like, where do I start? And so I don't know that there was a person who was a mentor that was there where I could bounce ideas off of a lot, but it was what I read, right? So I think of my mentors as the people who, and I tried to read everything I could get my hands on related to undeclared students. And it's kind of the basis for where my understanding is, right? But the folks who I would say kind of guided me through their writing were folks like Virginia Gordon and, you know, Tom Greitz wrote a bunch of things that early on in my career played a role in how I understood how to work with undeclared students. And so I think it was a lot of that. And so I spent, 3 years at Colorado State trying things out. And I was blessed to have supervisors that were like, yeah, try whatever, right? And there were so many things that I tried from reading in the literature that didn't work. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that again. Let's try something different, right? And through some trial and error, I started to find some things that I thought, well, this works and this doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that I missed out on, was that personal mentor I could go back and forth with, right? During that time. And I don't know why that is. I think at the time, maybe there weren't a lot of folks doing what we do in the way that we do, right? So I think as I got more and more into it, as I moved into the field more, I think it was the conversations with folks like you, with Tara at Cincinnati, with Brody, right? Some other folks who do what we do. Those conversations are kind of what filled the gaps for me in that mentoring piece. And it's probably part of why I see the world the way I do, right? In terms of working with undeclared students. So, my origin story was really an accident, right? I fell into it. And then, 6 months into it, I got to go. Who gets to do this when they're 6 months on the job? I got to go to a NACADA Summer Institute.
Wow.
And it was at that point that I actually started to understand what advising was at that institute, and met some amazing folks, both on the faculty and in some of the groups. And I think it was at that event that I finally realized, I was like, I don't have to figure out what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, because this is what I'm supposed to do, right? And it ties back to my major, right? I love stories. So now I get to talk to students about who they are, right? What their story's been, and what they want their story to be as they write it moving forward. And so I think that's it really connected with me on so many levels, but especially when I got to go to that institute.
What a gift to have that early in the career.
Yeah.
That's almost, in some ways, I had the fortune of going to a summer institute, and I just think about it almost like graduate school, a week of graduate school, just so much wisdom and so many great teachers who were there. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
I think our first interactions came after you had moved into your role at University of Texas at Austin. And I was always, sitting where I was sitting, I was always really impressed with the scale of your program there, and some of the cool things that you did there, the tech resources like the UT Wayfinder, where if people haven't had a chance to ever look at that, that's such a compelling website for exploring students. And then even some of the organizational changes that you were able to implement while there to kind of integrate the academic advising and career counseling pieces in service of exploration. Can you talk a little bit more about your time at UT and some of your experiences in leadership and organizational change there?
UT was I have such fond memories of I spent 12 years there. It was such a great place to work. Not that it didn't have its complications, its politics, its challenges, but I think it was a place where, and I think it still is for the most part, where it was just kind of understood professional development wasn't just this added benefit you got, it was an expectation of advisors, right? There was a giant community of advisors there. And I think when you come into an institution that sees the importance of advising like that, there's so much more you get to do, right? And there's a lot of resources with it. But the thing I got to do there was create that office, right? And who gets to do that very often? What was interesting is, much like my training when I started at CSU, where there wasn't a lot of detail, when I got the position to create this new office, my boss at the time was a dean from the classics. He was a classics faculty member. And I remember I started, and the first day he handed me a packet with recommendations that had been written about how do you start an advising office. And then he went on vacation for 3 weeks and expected me to have it all sorted out, right? I had a budget and that was it. Well, this report had questions that I had responded to. So it was essentially, he had given me my own work, right, as a guide. So I had no real framework to start from. And the big question was, how are we going to show we're successful, right, in creating this new office? And so nobody had an answer. So when you get to make that question up, you get to come up with the answers to that question. Suddenly, you get to create something that is exactly what you're hoping it'll be, right? And so I was blessed to get to do this. And they had only planned on us having maybe 3 staff. But by the time I left, we had 18, right? We were growing every year. But we had built it based on this idea of assessment being this tool to help tell our story, right? Again, it goes back to those stories, right? And so we're able to show kind of the effects of doing it. And at the same time, I started at a time when there was money for technology, right? So this Wayfinder thing, we had money for it, right? So we paid for some outside folks to come in and just build it. And I learned a lot, I think, the hard way there about how do you get parts of campus who aren't really interested in working with you to collaborate with you, right? That was a big part of that tech piece, was how do you get all the colleges to be involved? But the assessment piece was a big part of it. And then, I built this center. I thought it was ready to go. It was time to now just enjoy it. And that's when the dean decided to take the Career Exploration Center out of student affairs. And he wanted to smash it into our office, wanted to make it one big office. And that's something I don't think that we get taught how to do, right? If you got 2 cultures now, and inevitably one culture thinks the other culture has come in to conquer and take over, right? So how do you bring those 2 together? It was that drove thinking about the organizational structure in a different way, right? So I had to figure out, how do I separate these 2 cultures, even though I had built one that I was really happy with, right? But that necessitated creating these teams where we put career counselors and advisors together and assign students to that team, right? So now a student had an assigned advisor and an assigned career counselor who were sitting next door to each other in the office. And it became about, what's the team for the students, right? So then we started to pull in things like, oh, the Learning Center has these specialists assigned to us. Well, okay. So now you've got a team that has a specialist assigned to you, an advisor, and a career counselor, right? And then we had a program with that had been designed to mentor first gen and underrepresented students. Well, we assigned all the students that a professional mentor had in that office to the same advisor, learning specialist, and career counselor, right? So now you're presenting to the students a whole different model of support as opposed to your assigned advisor. And so that was kind of the experience at Texas, was I had this flexibility to do that because nobody knew what my job was supposed to be. And nobody knew how were we going to show we were successful.
I think that's really interesting at a school that size to be able to, create almost like a population health type thing, right? Where you've got attention to the nuances of the student experience within their reach, and sort of a high level of transparency for them on that. I mean, talk about supporting first gen students. If you could just make sure that they know who their advisor is and who they can go to for career questions and who they can go for affinity-based questions about their experience. Yeah. That's really amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah, well, and I was lucky. I had the dean that came in partway through my time there was great about letting us try these things, reorganizing and restructuring kind of how we supported the students. So, a lot of that goes to him giving us the freedom to do that.
Yeah. So one of the significant pieces to come from your work at UT and then your doctoral work at Alabama is the research that you did on undeclared students and persistence. And so I just direct listeners who haven't had a chance, read David's important 2020 NACADA Journal article. It's called Early Declaration of the College Major and Its Relationship to Persistence. And then you had a subsequent article in the Journal of College Student Retention, Undeclared versus Declared, who is more likely to graduate. There's a lot there in both articles, and I want to be careful not to reduce it, but can you nutshell a bit your findings and talk maybe a little bit about the response you've gotten from those who have actually engaged with your work?
I think there's I think an easy way to maybe reduce it. Because there's a lot of stats and people don't always like quantitative things. I think the thing that probably most stands out about it was it came from what I saw in daily practice, right? The question that I asked in both these studies was, really, are undecided students really that different from decided students? Is it really an at-risk kind of factor? And I wasn't seeing that in my daily practice, right? And I think that kind of illustrates that, research doesn't have to be this scary thing. It's just you see something happening and you have a question about it, right? So let's go find out what the answer is. But both of those articles, kind of in a nutshell, come down to this idea that maybe undecided as a characteristic isn't an at-risk factor, right? And that maybe when we take one characteristic to describe a student and we put so much weight on what that characteristic might mean or not mean, maybe that's not the way to go about it, right? Because students are much more complex than that, and they're much more unique, each and every one of them. And so, but the nutshell kind of pieces that came out of the findings are that really undecided students and decided students are no different, right? They're not these homogenous groups. They're groups of students that are full of all sorts of other characteristics and intersections of identity and experiences. And that's more likely to be important to focus on than did they start with or without a major, right? At the same time, I found that students who started without a major were more likely to persist, and they were more likely to graduate, right? So there's something about taking the time to figure it out, but also I think something that exists in that probably needs to be another study, and that is the students in this data set were at places where there was somebody who was going to help them explore. And so maybe having that intentionality of support is part of why they are more likely to persist, why they're more likely to graduate. But I think they're just making better choices, right? But in the end, again, it's about not saying just because of this one characteristic, does that make you more at risk? And I think that's true about other characteristics, right? When I think going back to the first gen thing, I grew up in white suburbia, with a lot of resources at the high school that I went to. So being first gen wasn't necessarily as much of a risk factor as I think sometimes we talk about it in the literature, at least for someone in my situation. It is for others, right? So I think we always have to be careful about taking that one variable and putting so much weight on it as the end all be all thing.
Yeah. Well, I think you and I have maybe talked about this in the past. Even if you have a targeted program for undecided exploring students, you don't have the market cornered. That the rest of the campus has those students as well, right? Even if they're in declared majors. And I see that pretty much on a daily basis, where we have students who come in and they're miserable where they're at and they want to redirect, And so I think there's absolutely a lot of truth to what you're saying. And I think too, I want to call out what you said about having that good company to be with them as they're as they're exploring and as they're going through this journey, where they have a sounding board to sort of process what they're experiencing. Have you heard much feedback from your publications at all? And not just from the community, but maybe from other folks who you've shared them with, families or other colleagues at work or things like that.
Yeah, it has an effect on the parents, right? Before I published these articles, when I would talk to parents at events or at orientation or at admissions related things, and talk about how being undeclared wasn't necessarily a bad thing, it's actually a great way to start school. They would kind of be like, oh, well, okay. But now to be able to say, well, okay, but here's the research, right? And actually, I know it because it's my research. The response is night and day, right? Folks are like, oh, well, then so yeah, our students should be undeclared. And I think we're seeing that with, in just the year and a half, 2 years I've been at Irvine, we're seeing substantial increases in the number of students putting undeclared on their application for admission, right? Because the story is different now. Yeah. So that's part of it. I think professionally, though, I've been surprised to be in these conversations where someone, I think it was at maybe the University of Utah, said they decided to take the question I asked and look at their own institutional data. And they found that it was the same result, that undeclared students were more likely to persist and more likely to graduate. So to see that other folks are now also asking that question at their own institutions, I think is amazing to see, because that's going to have an impact far beyond what I had hoped answering that question would have.
Outstanding. That is so cool. You referenced earlier, you referenced Virginia Gordon as kind of an initial mentor from afar for you in terms of the literature she produced. And I think you and I are both appreciative of the legacy and the contribution of Virginia to both the theoretical and practical knowledge base surrounding undecided exploratory students and career advising. For me, I see the research that you're doing as heeding her direct call for both more deeper scholarship and advising, and more specifically about undecided exploring students. So thank you for what you've been doing. I know you've also started to consider the evolution of Gordon's model for major exploration, and you shared this at a conference presentation at the annual in Portland. Can you talk a little bit about what Virginia's work means to you, and perhaps how you see her ideas poised for expansion as we move forward with our work?
I think the best way to, she was such a part of so much of what I was learning at the beginning. And her work is still so much in what I do every day, right? Every day there's something I'm doing that's probably tied to something that I read or learned, or eventually had a chance to talk to her about, right, in conversations. I think the best way for me to describe it is the first time I got an email from Virginia Gordon. I printed that email up and I ran around the whole office showing everybody. Nobody knew what I was talking about, but I was like, it's Virginia. She sent me an email. She wrote me a question, right? But I think her work, as this profession started to kind of emerge, right, there was this big void. And I think so much of what she did was fill all the spaces, right? Took care of that void. And she built what I think is the foundation of what we do. So I think the way that you describe it as, some of the new stuff I'm looking at as an evolution of her work, I think that's exactly what I'm intending it to be, is it's acknowledgement about just the importance of the foundation she set, right? So if we were building a house, she's built that foundation. And now the rest of us have to figure out, well, what does the house look like on top of that foundation? And that's going to mean some things that maybe she hadn't thought about, right? In part because the student demographics have changed, or some of the experiences at our institutions are different, or our understanding of what advising is and what kind of impact it can have is different. But yeah, so I always try to make sure, and this was important to me in Portland, was I had to make sure I was very intentional about saying, this isn't saying, when I say I want to change the model, that we're not saying the model, it's not saying the model's bad, right? It's just saying there's more that we can do. We can take this model further, right? And I think, we're starting to, the last few years especially, right, issues of inclusivity and social justice have come up. I think some of that lens needs to be considered when we think about this foundational work and how do we move it forward. And that's what's the driver behind that model that I talked about in Portland, was how do we make it more inclusive? How do we make it more comprehensive? And that's a good place for us, I think, to start.
And yeah, an important thing to do. And I think what you've tapped into is just how well situated that original model is to have additional floors added onto it, and to absorb new theoretical frameworks, to expand it and adjust it to make it more appropriate and maybe accurate for the dynamic populations that we encounter. So it's exciting that this is a road that you're going.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was lucky to work with you in NACADA leadership. We talked about just that really cool journey that you had through NACADA. You were vice president and president during my 2 years on the NACADA Council, and those were pretty formative years for me in terms of my growing understanding of the association and the relationships that I developed with other NACADA leaders who are valued colleagues and friends. What's memorable for you from your NACADA leadership experiences? And are there accomplishments that you're particularly proud of that kind of rise to the top as you think about that?
I think, some of the memorable things that pop out. I remember the first meeting I had as a brand new chair of a commission. And back then the meeting was in a giant room, and they had this huge rectangle shape where all 70 something interest group and commission chair, ingoing, outgoing, all these NACADA support staff. They were all just in this giant rectangle. And it was just such a weird experience. We changed it, obviously. By the time other folks came around, we were now meeting around round tables in smaller groups. But it was such a surreal experience. And I remember looking around the room, and there were 3 other people who looked like they were just new to advising as well, right? There were 4 of us in the room going, we don't know any of these other people that all seem to know each other. So that was a pretty memorable thing. I don't know that there's anything important about that memory other than I just remember that. I think, I remember having to go through restructuring the division. That was an experience, both with its positives and its frustrations. But when I think about, the accomplishments piece, I would dare to say that most of us understand that the accomplishments that happen while we're in these roles are not solely our own, right? That there's so many people involved in making those things happen. But I think of things like, when I think about things we did as a group, when we restructured the division, it led to something that's just we can't do enough of, right? Which is recognize advisors and recognize professionals. And so having a service to division award that didn't exist before was a big piece of it, right? Here's a way for us to thank people for volunteering their time, right? I think in terms of individual things, I think about when I became vice president and president, it was the first time I think in my own experience where it mattered to people that I was not white, but it mattered in a good way, right? I don't know that I'd ever experienced where it was a positive that I was different. But in those roles, it suddenly was a big deal. And to have advisors and professionals of color come up and say, thank you for being in that role. Because we now see somebody who doesn't look like everybody else in these roles. And that wasn't something I necessarily think I accomplished, but I think it's just something that stands out, right, as an experience. And I think the things that I feel the most proud of in terms of accomplishments have more to do with the individual conversations and mentoring that I've gotten to do over the last few years, right? To be able to help others find a way to get their voice out there, find a way to develop themselves as professionals, as practitioners, as scholars. Those are the things I think I put much more value in than the other things. I thought I gave a good speech as a president. I thought it was something that encouraged people to go out and do things, but really I think it's more of those individual mentoring kinds of experiences I've had since.
Yeah, those have been formal and informal, right? You did ELP, and
Yeah.
I think you had a pretty I think I remember you saying you had a really enjoyable experience with ELP.
I did.
Yeah.
I did, yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so now you're at UC Irvine, right? And you're in this director role, and you're also doing some teaching at Cal State Fullerton. And what's exciting for you about the work that you're doing now?
Oh, wow. I've worked at 9 different universities in my career. What I really love about this place, and it does it better than any of the other places I've worked, is that there's a value for expertise here that I haven't seen anywhere else. So the faculty that I work with and I report to, they don't see themselves as experts in everything. They see themselves as experts in what they know. And they see folks in advising as experts in advising, right? And so that expertise is kind of valued, it's supported. I have this amazing team that really kind of wants to learn. They want to learn, they want to grow, they want to develop, and they do it all because they understand that why we're here is because of the students, right? And I know a lot of people can say that about folks that work for them, but to have an entire team like that, I think has been just amazingly refreshing. I have a role where, like I said, that expertise is so valued. I have flexibility and autonomy to do what I want, to try what I want, which means I get to take time to write. It means I get to take time to do research on top of the work that we're doing as a team. And so I think that's part of it. I think I love that. I think all but one of the folks on my team were all people of color. And so the conversations about equity and inclusivity are in everything thing we talk about, right? That comes up in everything, and it's not something where there's this rigidity to try new ideas, to change policy, to change the way we approach things, and that's just been, I mean, unbelievably like a weight lifted off, right? Being able to do that without having to navigate a lot of the feelings, right? And at the same time, right, I get to teach. I get to teach at this other school. I get to teach people who want to work as professionals in higher ed. I get to teach them about student development. And then this year in particular, I have this awesome opportunity where I get to chair a dissertation for the first time. And so getting to help somebody figure out, how do I take my voice as a practitioner and a scholar and put it out there, has just been so much fun, right? So there's so much exciting about what I do. The one thing that's not is the commute from Fullerton to Irvine every day, but it's traffic in Southern California, right? But there's so much about what I get to do that makes it enjoyable to come to work.
That's really amazing about your team, that you've got, what a gift to your students to have that kind of representation from an advising staff. How big is your team right now?
There are 9 of us.
Wow.
And I think the only person who is not a person of color is our receptionist. Right. So even the student staff that we have 6 peer advisors. We have 3 student workers that work at the desk as well. They're all students of color. So the conversations are just different, right? Because we're able to talk about issues related to race and ethnicity, right?
I think I remember last year stalking your social media, and you had posted, and I think I remembered it because we were doing the same thing with my team, doing a common read with the NACADA LGBTQ publication that came out last year, and thinking, all right, that's awesome. I'm on the right track. Spight's doing this as well. So.
Usually if I'm doing it, it's probably a good idea to do the opposite, right? That's, I think, the best way to approach it.
Not in that case, though. That book was awesome. Is awesome. So cool. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll pivot a bit from the previous questions. I'm going to throw some things on your plate now. So your favorite NACADA annual or regional conference you attended, and why?
Probably an annual conference. It's going to be the one that I stepped in as president, but not because I stepped in as president, but because I had to give a speech as president. There was a woman sitting in the audience, and I'm now married to her. And so that's probably my best NACADA conference, which has nothing to do with the professional work that we do. Other than, my wife is someone who gets what we do in advising. She's a provost. She's a faculty member, but she gets what advising is about, and she's very supportive of it. And I think so many of the things that I've been able to do in terms of write, publish, I wouldn't be able to do had it not been for her coming into my life. So I think that conference in Vegas, I would say, was probably my best one.
Shout out to Carolyn. That's awesome. That's very cool. Very cool. All right. Tough question now. You just got sideline passes, box, court side, ringside seats to the sporting event of your choice. Are you heading to Denver, Austin, Tuscaloosa, England, or somewhere else?
Ooh. Before the season started, I would have said probably Denver for the Broncos, but right now I don't know that I would say that. I grew up playing soccer, because when you're small and scrawny like I am, that was the only sport that I think people would let you play for fear you might get hurt otherwise. So honestly, I think something like heading to see a World Cup final would be unbelievable, right? Regardless of where it is. I mean, right now would be great. I've had a chance to be out in that part of the world, and it's an amazing experience. But to see that, I think, would be an experience. Absolutely.
That's awesome. Okay, so say anyone listening to this right now is inspired by any of the wisdom that you've dropped today. What's the best way to connect with you, and if they want to continue the conversation, how can people get in touch with you?
Goodness, probably the quickest way is going to be via email, right? At any one of the many email addresses I have. But so at Irvine, it's Spight, Spight, right? At UCI, .edu, but LinkedIn is another way. I'm happy to connect with folks. I'd give out my cell phone number, but that could be dangerous.
Yeah.
No, I'm happy to talk about this stuff anytime anybody wants to reach out, by all means.
Well, I would just, as someone who's really benefited from a lot of meaningful conversations with you, and someone who's learned a lot from you, I would encourage that from others, and take advantage of the chance to connect with David on any number of things, whether it's undecided exploring students or advising administration or research and scholarship. And so with that, I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. But I just thanks again, David, for hanging out today and spending time. Any last thoughts that you want to put out there as we put a on this?
I want to say thank you to you. I think folks, if they really take the time to listen to the questions that you asked, there's such a thoughtfulness about the questions you asked that it illustrates really what advisors should do is be very thoughtful about the questions they ask. And I think it only reiterates that folks should get to know you, because the way you approach it is how it should be approached, right? So you are a shining example of how we're supposed to do this work of advising students, let alone undeclared, exploratory, or otherwise, right? So I appreciate the questions that you asked as just an example of that. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat. Like anytime you and I get to talk about undeclared students or talk about advising, it's a good day, right? I get fulfilled, I get fed. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks, David, for hanging out today, and thanks, Matt, for giving me the chance to chat with David and end on that note of mutual admiration society. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Matt. Thanks so much.